Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And as always, we say each and every time, smart to talk radio is in your future, and we are very pleased in this segment to have a good friend of the show, Stephen R. Bown. A prolific author, has written some extraordinary works about the Vikings and about Eskimos, and a brand new work called Island of the Blue Foxes, Disaster and Triumph on the World's Greatest Scientific Expedition. It should be a fascinating conversation indeed. He's the winner of the 2016 William Mills Prize, also known as Canada's Simon Winchester. He lives near Banff in the Canadian Rockies, and what a wonderful spot that is. Stephen, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing fantastic.
Well, we're very pleased to have you back here. Let's do a little bit of a setup. Tell us a little bit about, share again with our Lewis at Large listeners, a little bit about your background and how you became an author, and why these unique subjects of travel and expedition are so of interest to you.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I've actually always been interested in well, I hate to use the word crazy, but I'm going to use it. Crazy people who are setting off on, journeys, and I especially like the age of sail. I think part of it, and I really have to think here, is that in the age of sail, that several hundred-year period of time when Europeans had developed, massive sailing ship technology that was capable of going all over the world, the world was not really known very well, and consequently, there were no maps. There was no idea of how large it was. There was no idea of what they might encounter when they set off on these incredible journeys. And, sailing ships were incredibly primitive, well, advanced for their time, but primitive from our standards. Everything is to do with wind and muscle power. There's no electricity. There's no communication technology. So as soon as the ship left and off on its voyage, they were completely detached from the societies that, sponsored them. And so you're kind of left with a microcosm of human behavior that's stuck on the ship's company or wherever they ended up going. They can't rely on the institutions and the stability of their own cultures. They're left to deal with things just amongst themselves. And sometimes that produces some interesting stories.
Well, this is the story of an extraordinary journey in its scope, in its length, in its expense, beginning, I believe, in Russia and across to North America. First of all, is that right? Secondly, was that the goal? And tell us a little bit, give us some setup and history about the financing and the scope of the voyage indeed.
Yeah, first of all, yep, that is right. It was Peter the Great in Russia. Peter the Great is famous for trying to modernize the Russian state and continuing with the Romanov line of the famous emperors and empresses who autocrats who ruled Russia for hundreds of years. He had this idea that Russia was backwards at the time, and he wanted to bring it up to European standards, and he wanted to show Europe that Russia could contribute to global science and global knowledge and discovery, just as England and Germany and France and these other countries and the scientific revolutions that were going on there. He wanted to elevate Russia on the world stage, and one of his first things that he decided to do was to look east to Siberia, this vast, sprawling territory, which we now associate with Russia. And back then it was not fully Russianized, let's say. They had no map of it, and there was some Russian towns throughout it, but it wasn't very heavily populated, and it was not securely in the Russian, orbit of political influence. And so his idea was to send this massive expedition out across Siberia and document everything that was there, scientifically document it in terms of, what plants were there, what animals were living there, what the climate was, what the geography was, what the, was there anything valuable minerals, who was there, the people, how were they going to consolidate Russian political control over that region. So that was one of the main, objectives of that, and that was incredible. Expedition. It took 1/6 of the annual expenditures of the Russian state to fund this expedition of thousands of people crossing out Siberia, and they had to build, rafts. There was no roads, of course, so they had to build rafts, shipped all their equipment and all the people up the rafts, then portage over to the next river system using horses with packs loaded onto them, and sometimes dog sleds even, and then they would, float down the next river system, build some new rafts or new boats, and float up another system. It took them many, many years to cross the land. I mean, if you ever get out a map of the world and just look how big that is, it's just a staggering distance. And of course, the crowning sort of imaginary achievement of this grand expedition would be to get to the eastern coast of Asia and build ships, and then load the sailors onto the ships along with all the equipment that they carried with them for many years across Siberia, and set out across the Pacific Ocean. It sounds absolutely preposterous, and in many ways it was. I mean, they had no idea even what the Pacific Ocean, how big it was. I mean, hardly anyone had sailed across the northern part of it, and they certainly had no concept of the winds or the storms or who they might encounter once they got to, Pacific America. It was just a visionary and grand undertaking that, resulted, of course, a whole bunch of political consolidation of the Russian Empire in Siberia, but it also resulted in Russian claims on Alaska before it was, eventually they sold it to the United States, once the fur resources were depleted and before oil was discovered. But, this expedition just put it on the map, basically. And then, of course, the personal tragedy and the incredible story of survival that happened afterwards when the ships had an accident and crashed on the way home back to Russia.
Again, we're with Stephen Bown. This is yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large. Stephen has been a guest on this show a couple of times prior. We're talking about a brand new work called Island of the Blue Foxes, a unique story, disaster and triumph on the world's greatest scientific expedition. So we don't know what the Pacific Ocean really is all about. We're not 100% sure where we're going or what the terrain will be like. Who volunteers for this, or who is pushing this idea, and how do they get people to either volunteer, paid or otherwise, to go on something like this?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the question. I mean, that's part of what intrigues me about these kind of things. I mean, who would sign on to that? I know, like, say, the famous captain of the expedition, Vitus Bering, whose name the Bering Strait is named after. I mean, for someone like that, and some of the senior officers, if they had succeeded in their objective, their careers would be set. They would return as great heroes back to their nation, and they'd be wealthy for life and basically set up. But the crew of these ships, or some of the laborers who set out on the expedition, many of whom, of course, died either in the frozen winters of Siberia or dying with scurvy and shipwreck on the ships, or starved a little bit on the island before they were able to figure out how to survive. And for those people, I mean, they weren't earning a large amount of money, and history doesn't even necessarily record their name. Well, it records their names, but little else about them other than the date of their death and what their occupation was. So for them, who knows? I mean, I have to think to myself, whenever I'm writing these books about these explorers and these expeditions, would I be the one that signs on to that? Who do I know would sign on to an expedition like that? Because the only thing I can imagine that you would get out of it, unless you were the commander, was, satisfy your curiosity, I suppose. Or maybe life was so harsh on land for some of those people that the promise, of regular food paid for by the Navy was good enough. I mean, it's a valid question. It's a very personal question for the people involved, and it's impossible to really answer it.
Well, again, Vitus Bering of the Bering Strait, as you mentioned, what was he like as a person? What was his constitution all about? What kind of a leader was he? Yeah,
I mean, he was definitely a logistical mastermind. I mean, we just explained how difficult and challenging it was to get these thousands of people and all of their equipment and food and everything they needed. They were even bringing sails and cannons and cannonballs all the way across Siberia with no roads. It took a mastermind for him to be able to organize all those disparate groups and the transportation of all that equipment. And he was a naval commander in the Russian Navy, but he wasn't really he wasn't a flash and dash commander rushing in with cannons blazing and conquering ships. He was more of a planner and a strategizer. And I think, those are the skills which enabled him to get everything across Siberia and establish all the routes and to lay the groundwork for the expedition. But it wasn't necessarily very exciting. So I think by the time he got onto the ships and he was on the voyage, he was probably the wrong person for the job. He, as an executive commander of the overall thing, he was good on the ship. I think one of his subordinates actually just kind of claimed that maybe a bit more, maybe if he had a bit more, more fire and heat, I think was the quote, he would have been a better commander on the ship. So he was cautious and plodding, but that undoubtedly laid the groundwork for everything that came after. But he was unsuited to the job of being a commander, and he couldn't respond. I mean, this is the interesting thing. I mean, Russia has certain characteristics that we think of now, a little bit of political repression and, KGB and Secret Service spies and things like that. I mean, the truth is, all of that was around in the 18th century, too. And so when this expedition was going out there, they had these very strict, very deliberate orders drawn up by the powers in St. Petersburg. And people like Bering and the other commanders knew that perhaps their lives, but certainly their careers, perhaps the careers and the fortunes of their family depended upon following these orders to the letter. So for them to deviate from the orders that were laid out in St. Petersburg could have disastrous consequences for them. And as a result, they were unable to make decisions on the fly as situation changes in Siberia or as they're on the ocean. And they're rigidly following these rules to the letter out of fear of persecution by the secret police reporting back or someone claiming they were dishonorable to the state and then being branded a traitor. And of course, it was just beginning back then, but Siberia was the place where traitors were beginning to be sent to. So no one wanted to be banished to Siberia. And as a result, they were their wings were clipped. They couldn't make the proper decisions because the bureaucrats in St. Petersburg wrote up the orders for them, and they were afraid to deviate from that. It was a real problem on this expedition.
So back then, there's no cell phone, there's no internet, there's not much electricity, if at all. What kind of publicity, so to speak, and how well known outside of this tight little circle was this expedition known at all? How did they sort of publicize it or again, get people rallied around and sort of trying to be supportive of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question because it shifted throughout the expedition. Peter the Great's ambition for the expedition was to make the most of it, to do what the British did, with Captain Cook, just publicize it, turn their explorers into heroes and turn their scientific work into, an appendage of the state, a sort of like a ostrich feather, a plume in the hat, maybe, that displays to the world the great contributions of their state. I mean, that's what Peter the Great imagined that he wanted for Russia. A great expedition that accomplished incredible geographical and scientific objectives, as well as his own political objectives, but to announce it to the world and to use that to bolster Russian prestige. But of course he died, and then there was his wife, Catherine, and then Anna Ivanovna, his niece, took over, and they had a very different outlook on the world, and that's where the secrecy and the banishments were all coming in. Whoever was perceived to be disloyal to the state began to be, exiled to Siberia, and there was this great fear and repression, the political climate. So by the time that expedition had ended, the political situation in Russia was completely different, and the Russians completely hushed up that all knowledge of that expedition. And so no one really knew about it. They didn't want anyone to know about it. They thought anything we discovered shouldn't be for the benefit of anyone else. It'll just be for the benefit of us. We'll secretly exploit it. Maybe it's because of the disastrous shipwreck that happened. They didn't want it to perceive to have a negative influence on Russian accomplishment, or for whatever reason, it was completely hushed up at the end, and no one really knew about this expedition in its time. And as a result of people not knowing about it in its time, it never became a famously well-known expedition. And then, of course, throughout the 20th century with the wars and the revolutions, and then the Cold War, I mean, no one was really much interested in publicizing great or fantastically interesting Russian expeditions, and a lot of the information was hard to obtain or wasn't translated into English, and it was still very secretive. So it was only in the last little while that a lot of the information that I used to write this story actually became available in the English language particularly. So, yeah, it's an unusual story, how it was reported all the way through the ages.
Well, do this, simply in the interest of time, take us towards the shipwreck of the St. Peter. Talk to us about that, what led to that, and sort of take us through that period.
Yeah, I mean, that is the most dramatic part of the story. It culminates in this incredible, disastrous wreck due to a whole bunch of factors, which are really interesting but hard to explain all right now. The ships were all delayed, and there was a lot of infighting amongst the officers and men, and the two ships were separated on their voyages, and so when they came to Alaska, they couldn't communicate with each other. In either case, the scurvy began to latch on to the men, and scurvy, of course, is caused by a lack of vitamin C. We know that now. We can easily solve it, but back then, especially in a northern climate and in times when they're eating dried and salted foods, the mariners could become afflicted with that, and it would result in like a complete inability to think properly, no strength in their muscles, horrible disease. Anyway, the men on these ships came down with that right at the same time that they were trapped in the famously incredible storms of the North Pacific Ocean. And Bering's ship in particular was, spent many weeks being tossed about on the ocean with monstrous house-sized waves smashing down on the ship while the men were lying half dead, sometimes dying. The bodies were being thrown overboard. The masts were all snapped and shredded. The sails were ripped to pieces. The ship was damaged, and they had no idea where they were because they didn't have any navigation technology or maps. And finally, at the end of this incredible ordeal, the ship was driven over a rocky reef, and it sunk in a lagoon on an island. Now, of course, they didn't know it was an island. They first thought, we've reached Kamchatka, we're saved. And a few stragglers came onto the island, and then they kind of realized, this isn't really Kamchatka. And they had no idea where they were, and they started unloading themselves and the little bit of remaining, foods that they had on the ship, and they set up this camp on the beach, and people were still dying every day from the effects of scurvy, and then the frosts from the winter was coming, and the storms were still there. And then, to make it even worse, and this is where the title comes from the hills were drawn vast hordes of feral blue foxes. And the foxes were, if you Google them now, they look so cute. You can see some photographs of them on the web. But back then, they were most vicious creatures you could imagine. They came into the encampment where the survivors were trying to cobble a life together, and they were feasting on the corpses before they could be buried, and they were trying to eat some of the mariners before, they were so weak from scurvy they couldn't fight the foxes off, and the foxes were trying to eat them alive. They would also run through the encamp, defecating and urinating on any food stuff or anything that was left out. It was just this... It's hard to even explain how incredibly demoralizing and vicious the assault of the blue foxes was, and it went on for months. And many of the foxes were killed, and the foxes were attacking and eating the camp, and it was absolutely amazing that they were able to pull through that.
So about how many people were actually on the island?
Yeah, there was, of the two ships, there was about 75 people on each ship, and one made it back to Kamchatka, mostly destroyed and with half the men dead. The other one crashed on the island there, and I think there was about half of them, did eventually end up surviving. But when the ship actually crashed on the island, most of the men were unable to do anything. There was only a few who could barely even walk about. So it took them a long time to even get ashore with anything. And, of course, November on an Arctic island on the end of the Aleutian chain in Alaska there is not the best time to be on a deserted, uncharted island with no food. So, these small number of people managed to pull themselves alive, and it was the famous naturalist named Georg Steller, the famous German naturalist who was, well known these days for naming such species as the Steller sea lions and the Steller blue jays, which are around. He was able to identify which, frozen plants that they could possibly chip from the earth, and he was feeding these to the mariners and trying to get them to eat lightly boiled ptarmigan soup in order to cure their scurvy. And he did manage to nurse a whole bunch of the men dozens of them who were likely going to die. He managed to, bring them back to, back to health, and they did manage to survive. So I think it was about 40 people the next year, after surviving a year on that island, hunting like various sea creatures, seals and sea lions and all the different birds that were there, and the giant Steller sea cow, which is a type of a northern manatee which was hunted to extinction. They managed to hunt all these creatures without gunpowder. That is the amazing thing. No guns, because their gunpowder was destroyed in the wreck. They managed to survive the entire winter like that. In the spring, or the early summer, they were going out into the lagoon and they were cannibalizing the wreck of their own ship, and they rebuilt a smaller ship on the shore that was just big enough for the survivors to get onto it, and they managed to get off of the island after, being there for 11 months.
Well, Stephen, as we start to kind of wind down here a little bit, you talk about all this tale of woe and this extraordinary expense and human life and suffering and all the resources that went into this. How will history look at this? What were some of the accomplishments, and what was sort of the legacy, or how would we want to remember this whole great northern expedition?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at that in two different ways. I mean, it was, despite its disaster, it was very successful for the Russian government. Whether they got their money's worth, I don't know, because it was hugely expensive, so it's hard to really calculate. But, I mean, Siberia is Russian now. So Bering laid the foundation for the consolidation of Russian political control over all of northern Asia. Also, Alaska was Russian. So for hundreds of years after that, 150 years or something like that, it was Russian America. Russians attacked it. They conquered many of the indigenous peoples. They took it over and they ruled it and extracted as much as they could from the sea otter furs for a long time before they eventually sold it to the U.S. So from the political point of view, Russia gained an enormous amount of territory for their empire. Scientifically, I mean, all of Siberia was cataloged from its, plants and animals and minerals and everything. And, they compiled an accurate record of everything that was happening there. And Georg Steller in Alaska provided European scientists, who were then naturalists, they were called back then, with their first view of what were the plants and animals of Pacific America. So, scientifically and politically, he accomplished a lot. But what interested me personally, and I think is the most fascinating part of this expedition, is the personal struggle. That, the stories of the ships as they set off into the unknown across this Pacific Ocean, what they did along the coast of Alaska, how they, people were just so tough back then. It's amazing to me how they survived on this island in the middle of nowhere. It's the personal story that's left to me. The rest is the context. The context of the story is very interesting. The politics and the science and Peter the Great and the Russian Empire. I mean, that's a very interesting background, but that wouldn't be enough to interest me, I don't think, without the personal stories of several of the people on the expedition kept detailed journals of everything that was going on the ships and the infighting and the quarrels between the officers and the storms and the scurvy and how they managed to survive and what they did on the island. And it was really interesting. In order to survive, they had to completely restructure their social order from a naval order with a captain and officers and the obedience of the men right away, and they formed into smaller, distinct groups, each responsible for their own activities, with all decisions being made by a show of hands. And even, the lieutenant who took over when Bering died, because Bering, died in unfortunate circumstances on the island, and Steller recognized that they were not going to pull together with officers ordering the men around, and the men, looking very threatening and murmuring about mutiny or whatever. And so it was the idea that they, like how they survived and how they shifted their social order and to be more democratic so that they could pull together and work as a unit in order to survive.
Well, the work is called Island of the Blue Foxes by Steve Bown, and a prolific author of The Last Viking and others. The Disaster and Triumphs is of the world's greatest scientific expedition. Hey, Steve, how can people pick up a copy of this and also check out some of the previous works we've talked about on this show in the past?
Yeah, I mean, well, people would find this book basically in any bookstore, of course, on Amazon as well. I mean, it's available widely everywhere, and it actually is the most incredible story. I had the idea for 10 years now, and it's only in the last few years I realized enough material now exists for me to write this story, and I'm glad that I waited because I was able to bring it more fully alive. And it's just outstanding. It's such an unusual tale, and it's so massive. It's amazing that we wouldn't even really know very much about it.
Indeed. Well, listen, again, thanks you so much for sharing, and really appreciate your time.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after